This year at First Christian Church, we're exploring sacred connections, our vertical relationship with God and the horizontal relationships that we have with each other. And during our current sermon series, we're asking the question, why can't we be friends? Right? There's an old 70s pop song, why can't we be friends? Right? You remember that song, which has been on in my head is on a loop here for the last couple of weeks. So we're asking that question because we know how complicated human relationships can be. Conflict has been around as long as people have been around. We know from reading the opening chapters of Genesis, it only took 2 generations. In the second generation, people were already literally killing each other. The firstborn son of Adam and Eve, Cain, murdered his brother Abel in a jealous rage. And when God showed up a little later and asked Cain where his brother was, Cain famously replied, "Am I my brother's keeper?" Now, I'm pretty sure Cain felt like his brother's well-being wasn't his responsibility. But he was wrong. The answer to his question was clearly, yes, you are your brother's keeper, and he yours. When we ask the question, why can't we be friends, the world has a million different reasons why we're divided, why we're conflicted, because human beings can create conflict and division over almost anything. But there are 2 barriers to friendship and to relationships that we don't often think about, that I want to focus on today. And those 2 things have also been around since the beginning: sin and suffering. They don't divide us the same way language or race or nationality or politics do, but if we're not careful, the results of sin and suffering can be just as bad or even worse. So let me give you some examples. For instance, when someone makes bad decisions in their lives, when they go down dark paths, we all experience that, either personally or in our families. We know that those bonds of family, those bonds of friendship can be stressed or even broken. Because of sin and the shame that often comes with it, we can be tempted to condemn people. We can be tempted to even abandon people completely. Unfortunately, this happens a lot in churches. I've even heard the church accused of being the only army that shoots its wounded. Or I would say the only army that abandons its wounded on the battlefield. And we do. Strangely enough, the suffering of our friends and family can often work in a similar way. For instance, someone gets a terminal diagnosis or experiences some terrible family tragedy, and suddenly no one in their circle of friends knows what to do. They're afraid they'll say or they'll do the wrong thing, and so they stop calling, they stop coming around. I've seen it happen many times. I remember once, years ago, hearing the story. My brother-in-law was working in an office in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and there was a man in his office whose teenage son committed suicide. Everyone in that office knew what had happened. They all felt terrible for him and for his family. But when it came time to go to the funeral, the only one who showed up was my brother-in-law and my sister. Not because they knew the right thing to say, because there is no right thing to say in a situation like that. They went because they were a part of a church, a Christian church, Disciples of Christ church, just like this one, that taught them to bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. The law of Christ is love. The law of Christ is to help those who are struggling. We're called to walk with those who are overwhelmed in suffering and grief, and those who are lost in sin and selfishness. We are responsible for one another, especially in the body of Christ. In Paul's letter to the church in Galatia, our text for today, he spells out those responsibilities in Galatians chapter 6, beginning at verse 1, where we read, My friends, if anyone is detected in a transgression, you who have received the Spirit should restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness. Take care that you yourselves are not tempted. Bear one another's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. For if those who are nothing think they are something, they deceive themselves. All must test their own work, then that work, rather than their neighbor's work, will become a cause for pride. For all must carry their own loads. Paul reminds us here that we do have responsibility for one another. We are our brothers and sisters' keepers. And sadly, that can sometimes mean confronting those who willfully do destructive things to themselves or to others. In church circles, sometimes that's called church discipline, a phrase that I've never really liked, and which I can tell you from experience, it's one of the least favorite things for me about ministry. Strangely enough, there are some people who do enjoy that kind of thing and like talking about that kind of thing. I've had elders in churches that wanted to talk about church discipline all the time. They would bring up scriptures like the one we just read from Galatians, and also this one from Matthew chapter 18, where Jesus says, if another member of the church sins against you, go and point out the fault when the two of you are alone. If the member listens to you, you have regained that one. But if you are not listened to, take one or two others along with you, so that every word may be confirmed by the evidence of the 2 or 3 witnesses. If the member refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if the offender refuses to listen even to the church, let such a one be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. 2 categories that were not particularly popular back in the day. In my experience, anyone who's eager to do that, okay, anyone who wants to go and confront somebody about their sin should never be allowed to do that. Never. Find someone else to do it, anyone else. Find somebody that doesn't want to do it and send them. Like Paul said, it should be done in a spirit of gentleness. The goal is not condemnation or punishment. The goal is restoration, redemption, connection. A great example of this kind of restoration is found in one of my favorite Old Testament stories about King David. You may remember the story. It happened not long after David had his thing with Bathsheba, which was all on him, by the way, really not on her. She had no power in that situation. And then she winds up pregnant, and then David arranges for the murder, the death of her husband Uriah. Now, David had a friend, Nathan, who was a prophet, the very first prophet, in fact, who went to David. He knew he'd gone down a dark path. He knew that. And he went to him with the intention of confronting him. But instead of starting off with an accusation, right? Instead of coming in hot, which probably wouldn't have worked anyway, it would have probably just put David on the defensive, Nathan did something creative. He told David a story. He told him a story about a man who had a pet lamb that he loved. He treated that lamb like a child. And then that man's rich master took the little lamb away from him, slaughtered it, and fed it to his friends, his rich friends, for a barbecue. When David heard that story, he said, that man should die. And Nathan said, David, you are that man. Nathan approached David not only with the truth, but he approached him in such a way that David was able to hear that truth and respond in a faithful way. And as a result, David repented. He did what was right. That was restoration. That was redemption. It worked. And I've seen it work in more modern times too. In fact, I'm going to tell you a couple of stories now about similarly sensitive situations that happened in a church I served 30 years ago. So I figured the statute of limitations is up on those stories now, so I can safely share them. So the first story is a success. story, which is fun to tell. And I probably, at least a few of you may remember me talking about this before. The other is a story about something that didn't work out so well, which I think is partially a result of my own immaturity and inexperience at that time in my ministry, and partially because people have free will. So the first story started out when two men approached me on a Sunday morning out of concern for a young woman in our church that we all knew was drinking herself to death. She was. We knew it. And one of the reasons we knew that is because she would sometimes call us in the middle of the night when she was drunk. Okay, this was back in the day before cell phones, right? This was when your bedside landline would ring. And so one of the men who approached me was her ex-boyfriend. He wanted to see her get sober. She didn't want that. They broke up. The other man was her brother, and they came to me together. And I knew I was in over my head, like right away. I'd never dealt with anything like this before. But we went ahead boldly with a plan. We wanted to confront her in a gentle way, but one that would also get her attention. So one Saturday morning, we had her best friend pick her up and tell her that they needed to go to the church. For some reason, I don't remember what we told her. And when they got there was a whole group of her family and friends waiting for her. Each of them then took turns, telling her how much they loved her, how much she'd hurt them because of her addiction, and how much they wanted to see her get better. The impact that intervention had on her life was nothing short of amazing. When I went to serve another church a couple of years later, that same woman gave me her 5-year coin, okay, which is for her recently completed 5 years of sobriety as a going-away gift. And I still have it, treasure it. She was restored, and her friends and family helped that happen in a spirit of gentleness and love. The other story, of which I'm not so proud, happened not long after I arrived at that same church. Right away, small town, right, I began hearing rumors that the school superintendent who taught the high school Sunday school class and whose wife sang in the choir was having an affair with his secretary. And everybody knew it. So one of the leading women in the church, this was a woman to be reckoned with, she wanted his head on a platter. That's the only real way to describe it. She wanted me to fire him from his high school Sunday school job and tell him he couldn't teach our kids anymore. And the only thing that I wanted to do at that point was bury my head in the sand. To tell you the truth, I don't even remember how it all got resolved. You know how sometimes when you wait long enough, things kind of just take care of themselves, you know? That's what I think happened in this situation. Eventually, he stopped teaching the Sunday school class, so the pressure was off of me. The wife dropped out of the choir. They stopped coming to church. But while all of that certainly made my life easier, it's not a success story. Not at all. No one was restored. No burdens were shared. It's just another sad story in a world filled with sad stories. Now, I don't know if I would have approached him in a spirit of gentleness, if that would have made any difference. Maybe not. Like I said, people have free will. He might have denied it. He probably would have. But I didn't even try. I was young and green, but mostly I was afraid. Now, if you're like me, all of this talk about confronting people in their sin might make you a little uncomfortable. And I get that. It does me too. After all, Jesus did say, "Do not judge so that you may not be judged. Why do you see the speck in your neighbor's eye, but do not notice the log in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take the log out of your own eye. Then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your neighbor's eye." In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus warned us about judging each other. But he wasn't saying we shouldn't help each other get the speck out of each other's eye, right? He didn't say we shouldn't do that. What he said was we should check ourselves first Check yourself first. In other words, we need to deal with our own stuff before we can help others deal with their stuff. And I think that's what Paul was getting at in that last verse of the text we just read from Galatians when he said, "For all must carry their own loads." He wasn't saying we shouldn't help each other, and he wasn't contradicting himself, even though it kind of looks like he was. He wasn't. We should help each other, but in the end, we can't fix anyone else. If they're not willing to carry their own load, there's not much more we can do. My favorite definition of codependency is when you care more about solving someone else's problem than they do. That's what codependency is. You don't want to be in that position because it doesn't work. Help each other bear their burdens. Help people bear their burdens, encourage them, correct them, give them the tools that they need to make good choices, right, and thrive. But don't be codependent, because in the end, we all have to carry our own loads. Paul was a smart guy, and the reason I know that is because that advice still holds up 2,000 years later. Even psychotherapists will tell you that. Paul understood the importance of the horizontal relationships we have with one another, especially in the church, in the community of faith. He understood how much we need each other, both when we're struggling and also when we're suffering. In his first letter to the Corinthian church, he wrote, "If one member suffers, all suffer together. If one member is honored, all rejoice together." As I like to say, when we are connected to each other in the body of Christ, our burdens are lightened on the one hand, and our joys are magnified. That's what happens when you're a part of a community of faith. It's a win-win. Years ago, a beloved pillar of the church died, kind of suddenly and unexpectedly on a Saturday night. This was someone I'd known for years. He'd even come from the church I was serving right out of seminary. He'd come to my ordination. The next morning, as I was preparing for worship, I saw the man's widow, walking down the hallway towards the sanctuary. And I was surprised to see her just hours after her husband's death. And I said so. She said, "Where else would I go?" In that moment, I understood. She was right where she needed to be. Absolutely. She knew her church would be there to walk with her in her pain and grief. Not carry it for her, but to bear her suffering with her. Of course, no church ever gets it right all the time. Sometimes we fail each other because we've lost faith that change is even possible, right? We give up on other people. Sometimes we fail each other because we're afraid we're going to say the wrong thing or we're going to do the wrong thing. And sometimes we fail each other just because we're human beings. As someone once said, the church is not a museum for saints, but a hospital for the broken. If only perfect people were allowed here, none of us would be here. So the only thing we can do is handle each other gently in both our sin and our suffering, because we need each other. As Bill Withers sang in another pop song from the 1970s, "Lean on me when you're not strong, and I'll be your friend. I'll help you carry on, for it won't be long till I'm going to need somebody to lean on." That's true. Storms will come. Mistakes will be made. It's not a matter of if, but when. I'm going to need somebody to lean on, and so are you. So hang in there and follow Paul's advice. Correct those who have strayed, but deal with your own stuff first. Bear one another's burdens, and learn to deal gently with one another in love, because in so doing, we fulfill the law of Christ.